everyone, to Battle Hardened, America's Backbone. Today you have the host Samuel Markley, myself, and then Avery Davis, ETSU graduate and military historian. Um, Last week, if you weren't with us, we went over the polar bear expedition, a very interesting, kind of forgotten piece of history. So we went through that, the Doolittle Raid, the 25th Infantry's time in Vietnam, and today we will be going over the Battle of Fort McHenry, a huge achievement for the Americans in the War of 1812. Um, so just a little bit of an overview for this battle. You're going to see a time period from September 13th through 14th, 1814. The battle's total time was 25 hours. We'll get into the 25 hours later. So basically, this is the British hoping to capture Baltimore after burning Washington, D.C. Um, so you have Fort McHenry, which was the guarded entrance to Baltimore Harbor. So you're going to see the British trying to get into Baltimore, so they're going to have to go through Fort McHenry first to do so. Um, and then if you're looking at the key commanders during this battle for both sides, you're going to have the U.S. Major George Armistead, and then the British, you're going to have Admiral Cochrane and Admiral Cochrane. So basically, the whole goal of this um, for the British was to bombard the fort, basically in the Americans just giving up, and then British would just be able to sail right into the harbor. So I'm going into kind of the lead up. I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Avery.
All right. Thank you, Samuel. So, kind of the rundown when we're talking War of 1812. The Embargo Act in 1807 is going to cause a lot of ruffles between the U.S. and Britain and a lot of trading partners. Got to remember that overseas, the Napoleonic Wars are going on. Europe has their hands full with fighting Napoleon, who is just on an absolute tear going into this. James Madison becomes president in 1809. Then you've got the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. That's going to be the first kind of like, what really gets that going is the American frigate, the USS President, is going to fire on the British ship, the HMS Little Belt. That's not really good for two countries that are having tensions already. June 18th, 1812, the U.S. will declare war on Great Britain, and we will begin to try to invade Canada from the north. But we are not very good at war. You got to remember that this country is young, and this country has been fighting not very much since the Revolutionary War. We were very disorganized then, and we are still not great at what we do. So we lose a lot of forts in the north. There's a lot of skirmishes in Michigan. Um, let's see. Britain captures Fort, I'm going to mess this name up, Michilimackinac. I'm going to call it Fort Mac if I say it again. But the U.S. will retreat down into Ohio near Toledo, I believe. And Napoleon will be exiled, allowing the British to turn full attention to the U.S. That's a big one. There's a couple of other like battles that happen in Canada and stuff, but what really sets up the Chesapeake campaign that we're going to be talking about is the British being able to turn their forces towards the U.S. war. The British know that America is weak. They've been kind of on the run, retreating south. The British will send a fleet up the Potomac to cut off river access to Washington, D.C. You got to remember that before this happens, they have already marched on Washington, D.C. and just absolutely ruined the place. They have burnt the White House down. There's a famous portrait of Martha Washington, I think, that is something that was saved. James Madison and his cabinet and other like politicians and workers and stuff, they're going to flee to Maryland, specifically Brookville, Maryland. So this is kind of what sets up the the Chesapeake campaign. Again, the British know that America is weak, and the British are going to send a fleet up the Potomac to cut off river access to Washington, D.C. U.S. soldiers will flee Fort Warburton without a single shot fired in fear of the British, like just due to the size of their navy. And that's going to cause the city of Alexandria to surrender. The British will proceed to loot that city for days. They just go through and they're raiding shops and ships and everything. So that's kind of like the background that's going to lead up to Fort McHenry. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Just kind of getting into a little bit of like the defensive prep for this battle. You're going to see where this fort was pretty much specifically reinforced after learning about and all the other British victories were already going on in the War of 1812. You're also going to see that this fort was it was pretty much it was pretty much high tech for the time, and I'm not meaning like tons of technology was involved with it, but this fort was in a star shape, which was it was very key for defensive strategy. You have the angled walls, which could easily defect or deflect cannonballs, and everything. So you're gonna see where the U.S. was losing a lot leading up to this, but they were kind of prepared for what was going to happen up towards Baltimore. Like you said, Washington D.C. was kind of already being burnt, or obviously already burnt and everything. And so you had where they were like, okay, Baltimore is probably next. But the difference was that in Baltimore there were people that were ready to fight, and they were very ready to take on the British rather than the British would just come in and it would be an easy run through. Um, so, like you said, going into kind of the British strategy behind all this, the British just wanted to crush the American spirit, get a lot over with. They thought that Baltimore would fall easily, that they would get another key place in America to carry out the rest of the war, however long they thought that would take. Um, and you're also going to see that, like I already said, I mean, you have the Baltimore people were expecting and ready and willing to fight. So they'd been preparing for a while for whenever the British finally did step on their turf.
Before we get into the battle, do you care if I go into a little bit more on Fort McHenry itself?
Sure.
Okay. So, like you said, it was a large star shaped fort built in 1800. Take into account that we were in the year 1814. The fort is only 14 years old. When you think about buildings in this day and age, it's like, yeah, that building's been there for a while. At this time, it was like you said, state of the art. This was new engineering. Um, they were really anticipating this fort being like good at what it's supposed to do. Each of the five star points had four cannons, and then there were 23 total in the fort. There were no shelters, like really, around the fort. It was kind of just men out in the open. At this time, there were four U.S. Army regiments with three Baltimore artillery companies of Maryland militia, total of about 1,200 men stationed around the fort. There was a dry 3 to 4 foot moat, and there were 40 French naval cannons requiring 18 men per gun in and around the fort. So they had different battery positions that were set along the river outside the fort. The Chesapeake flotilla, mini navy kind of, had a lot of like flat bottom like gun barges that were about 50 to 75 feet long. They're going to come into play big time in the battle. And there were 8 to 10 merchant ships that they sank before the battle to prevent the British from sailing in. And then they put a boom chain across the harbor as one of the big lines of defense there. You talked about civilian, like, or the working on defenses leading up to the battle. I kind of want to talk about that. And when we talk about America's backbone, it's the people that live here, the people that make this country what it is. So, following the British victory at Bladensburg, there was a committee of vigilance and safety that was set up in Maryland. These were really common during the American Revolution. It was just like a town hall meeting, but it was a bunch of people that would get together if something bad happened, and they were like the people that planned, you know, if the city's attacked, here's what we do for the people of the city. So this vigilance and safety committee was headed by Mayor Edward Johnson and consisted of 30 merchants, manufacturers, and business professionals. They asked all able bodied men not in the militia to help build defenses and bring rations and tools, and they would work dawn to dusk building earthwork entrenchments around the city and around the fort. People were so moved by the burning of the White House that they laid aside all differences, whether they supported the war or not, whether they were freed African American men or slave owners, that gender difference, everything was put to the side. And it was realized that we, as the people of this country, have to step up and defend ourselves. We have to do what's right to defend our country and help our troops. So you want to talk about some real in every war we talk about support from the home front. These people are the American backbone that support the troops. These are the people that we make this show to highlight. And so with the 4th of July here kind of, this being like a themed episode around that, I just want to give a shout out to all the people of the United States. In uncertain times like we have, it's important that, when it comes down to it, we lay aside differences to support everybody in this country, um, for what's best for our military and for others. So, um, rant aside and introduction to the earthwork defenses, um, yeah, there was just a lot of cool stuff going on with that civilian work. They did all that in 3 weeks. They built over a mile and a half of entrenchments around the fort. So, again, just a lot of good stuff by what I consider to be America's backbone in this battle, the civilian support.
Yeah, definitely. And like throughout history, like you mentioned, you can go back and look at every single war that America has fought in, and you can look at during the time period leading up to that, and even through it, there were a bunch of problems, racially, civically, there were tons of problems going on. But in times of war, you are always going to see that America has stepped up and everyone has been able to come together. Um, in order to just create, like we said, America's backbone. They've built on it for all the years. That's one thing America has always been great at doing. In times of need, we can all stand together for one cause, and that's just great. Um, so going kind of more into building more into the war, or the not the war, the battle itself. Um, so you're going to see that this, like I mentioned earlier, was a 25-hour battle, pretty much. It was 25 hours straight where the British was in warships set outside of the Baltimore port, um, outside Fort McHenry, and they were just basically sending over bombs and rockets. And an interesting thing on the rockets used here, you're going to see that these rockets they're using are the Congreve rockets. These were a newer technology. You're going to see them first being used basically here and in the Napoleonic Wars. You're going to see where the rockets have been used earlier in history, especially with the Chinese and everything. But those were more so like fireworks than rockets. These rockets are actually ones that will cause damage. Um, the Congreve ones. So you're going to see where these British ships, I mean, the British were acting smart about this. The British ships stayed out of range of America cannons on Fort McHenry. They were staying to where they could make contact with the fort, but they wouldn't take anything themselves. So you're going to see where the fort was being hit constantly, but like we've said with this star structure, and how new of a fort it was, the fort was standing up great. Um, and you're going to see where, the American morale inside the fort was staying up. I mean, America had been on somewhat of a downfall earlier in this war, if you want to put it that way. So they're finally wanting to take that stand to show that, like, if we're not going to go down unless, I mean, we're going to go down swinging, is an easy way to put it. Um, so you're gonna see where, like I said earlier, the rockets weren't on the bombs, of course, were hitting the fort and everything, but these rockets, the newer technology, it wasn't just something to cause devastation or like hit on impact. You're gonna see where there's accounts that these rockets were very loud, and they created a very loud and kind of eerie whistling sound. So, being in that setting, I mean, I'm sure, and there are accounts for it that it caused like a psychological kind of issue where you're kind of being surrounded by all this noise, that was new for the time. I mean, you're used to these like bombs hitting, cannonballs, gunshots, but these loud, like whistling, eerie sounds coming from these rockets just added another level to the psychological side of this battle. Um, so if you're looking more inside of the fort during this, you're gonna see where the U.S. had about 1,000 defenders, um, and you're gonna see that the fort did have bomb-proof shelters, and then you're gonna see that um, they had a purposely large American flag flying over top of it, and I'll get more into why this flag is so important for American history itself. Avery, if you wanted to add anything to all I said.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about that beginning of the battle there. This all takes place. The Battle of North Point is kind of like it's classified as a separate battle, but it is a lead up operation. So McHenry takes place on September 13th. September 12th, British forces land and advance inland under Major General Robert Ross, who was the same general that burned D.C. U.S. General Samuel Smith, who was in charge of some of the forces around the fort, ordered Brigadier General John Stricker to skirmish and delay British troops. Stricker took men and cannon to attack the British forces while they had stopped for lunch on the road to McHenry and Baltimore. General Ross was killed by rifle fire, and Colonel Arthur Brooke took over. This is important because when you start to look into like the battle itself, the British forces were a little all over the place because their command structure had now been changed. They lost Robert Ross, who was successful throughout the war so far. Like I said, he burnt DC. He's going to get the credit for that and was tasked with leading the land assault for this. But when he is killed, it complicates the coordination between the British land and naval forces. So that's when the British admiral takes over and is kind of like, I'm the senior officer here. Here's what we're going to do. And I don't want to say that Colonel Brooke is really inexperienced at leading troops, but he kind of is. And it's hard to coordinate what you think is going to be like the final blow to Americans when your leadership chain is that destroyed. It's hard to take somebody that's not been in charge of those troops like in that fashion and lead full assaults at such a pivotal battle. The Americans, funny enough, at this skirmish at North Point, are going to run out of artillery shells from what General Stricker had brought, and they're going to start putting scrap metal in the cannon barrel and shooting that before retreating. You talked about the kind of beginning of the battle there. I don't want to lead too much further into what you want to say, but I did want to point out that the British goal is to use combined arms and forces, so using like land assaults. They have the Royal Marines on hand, um, the Navy. They want to use all different kinds of branches that we would call them and dislodge American forces and eliminate Fort McHenry. McHenry is the second to last line of defense going to Baltimore. The U.S. did have 10,000 soldiers positioned in front of Baltimore if Fort McHenry fell. But McHenry is kind of like yeah, we need to stop them now because we don't want to have to get back to just those land troops.
Yeah, yeah, the Battle of North Point, like you said, a huge factor leading up to this. And basically, like you also said, still basically a part of this battle. You could definitely merge the two or keep them separate, and it works either way. So before I get into like I said, I was gonna get into the flag and everything. Before I get into that, I'm just gonna go ahead and pretty much um point out things that were British failures during this. So you're gonna see where, like you mentioned, North Point, that land attack was totally stalled. So that pretty much became ineffective. Um, and then you're gonna see where they, they were positioned to where they weren't gonna take any hits, but America wasn't giving up either. They weren't. They were like Fort McHenry was holding up great. America wasn't facing too many casualties. Actually, if you're looking at the casualties of the battle, you're going to see that only four Americans were killed, 24 were wounded, and like I said, you had around 1,000 defenders during this, so not many casualties at all. Um, so you're going to see that I don't think the British were necessarily ready for the American spirit. Like I mentioned, American morale was kind of down at this point, and the British really thought that once they got into Baltimore, they were just going to go on another tear like they were in D.C., and pretty much have this war won. But you're going to see that America was finally ready to take that stand, that was Fort McHenry. And if you want to look at, just like a side note, going into Fourth of July, you can look at this battle as like one of America's most important um, victories in our history. Um, this was this was the battle to win American morale and put that, like like we've said, the American backbone in place pretty much. Like you've had the Revolutionary War up to this point that you can look at and say, yeah, these dudes were ready to fight, stand up for America, build that backbone. But this was like the final piece to that backbone that we added on to since. But this was finally establishing America kind of as that military figure that we know of now. So you're also going to see that the U.S. position was being strengthened during this. There were numerous talks going on at Ghent. So the U.S. was on the up after being on the downfall for a long time. So did you want to add anything onto that?
I just wanted to say, you talked about the American spirit and the British positioning themselves out of range of fire. Major General George Armistead, who is the general over Fort McHenry, he knew that their cannons would not reach the British ships, and he still purposely fired the cannons as much as he did just to show, hey, we may not be able to hit you that far, but we've got some fight in us. Like we got some spunk. And that's kind of his whole point in like keeping up that solid barrage of fire. The British could not get large battleships up this channel. It's too shallow to like send full on battleships. So they were sending like little bomb vessels that, like you said, launch exploding shells, which is very influential. Some might say there was something about the rocket's red glare and these bombs bursting in air. Foreshadow. That was horrible. But that this 25-hour battle of shooting, like some people say, well, they didn't really hit very much. It was kind of pointless. that's maybe the worst take of all time. I'll go ahead and say it. Like that's a horrible take for anybody that wants to say that. I hate to say somebody's wrong, but that's wrong. This is, like you said, we could consider this one of definitely, in my book, a top 20, top maybe 10 battle of significance in American history. Like, this being one of the most significant battles that America has taken place in. So I rate it that highly myself. Can I talk about one of the battle conditions real quick? Okay, so the battles takes place starting about 6 a.m. is when the shelling starts. The British fire the first shot as kind of like a warning shot there. What happens next is you said that 25-hour battle. Later that morning, there's going to be a bunch of dark clouds set in around the area, and it's just going to like just pour, just rain cats and dogs like this whole battle. So they're doing all this artillery firing and everything in constant driving rain. Um, there were more than 1,500 projectiles shot at this battle, and I brought one of these. This is a cannonball from around the time period. Um, Pretty heavy little thing, and like the rocket shells that exploded and had some more speed to them and stuff. They were important, but any one of these things would cause a pretty significant amount of damage to be in the way of. So when you look at a cannonball and you just kind of like feel the weight and how heavy it is and stuff, it kind of puts into impact like, dang, this fort was tough to withstand all that, and those civilian-made fortifications stood through it. They were some really good entrenchments dug by some non-military personnel, but yeah, that was just kind of the beginning of the battle and setting the atmosphere kind of thing that just makes it really impressive and interesting.
Yeah, and going back to something you said just a little bit ago, about how even though the British were out of range, that America kept shooting. Um, Honestly, you could probably say that now this is based on how the British acted and were held during the time period. The British were probably thinking, "Oh, these Americans are so stupid that they're shooting all these cannonballs and they're never going to reach us." So they were probably acting somewhat as, "Oh, America's foolish for doing this." But America knew that if they kept shooting and they were just eating the British cannonballs, but if they kept shooting, that eventually it would take a toll on them, and it did. And I'm sure that the British were unexpecting of that. Like I said, they were probably thinking they're never going to hit us. Why are they doing this? They're just wasting ammunition at this point. But over time, that takes a toll on you. So now going into like you foreshadowed, if you didn't guess, this is where the Star Spangled Banner um, comes to be, basically. So you're going to see that a shell does hit the flagpole of this giant American flag. But what happened is they knew if the American flag went down, that was going to be a major issue. So they used whatever they could find, like the soldiers inside the fort used whatever they could find um, to prop that flag back up to make sure that that flag was still standing, to keep that morale boosted and everything. And I mean, this flag was visible for a long ways. Like this flag was so huge, and they were able to put things
This
up.
flag, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Good.
This flag is there were two flags at Fort McHenry, and I just kind of wanted to clarify this. Two flags. One of them was like the standard. They call it the storm flag, which is put up at this battle. It's a pretty large flag. It's like 15 feet or something, which is, I mean, a pretty big flag. The other flag, which you're fixing to get into, that I didn't mean to interrupt you on, but
You're good.
um, it is even bigger. I have the measurement, I think, on it written down. It was like 34 by 42 feet
Yeah.
when this next flag gets put up. But yeah, so like you think of like how big a 15-foot flag is. they had some crazy big flags back then. Just amazing.
Yeah, basically, if you're ever like driving on the road and see one of those really big American flags flying at like a car lot or something, it's basically like that, but flying over a fort. And at this time, I mean, that's huge. I mean, it's still a huge flag today. But
I wonder how long it takes to make that.
I mean, back then, your hand sewing everything.
Make it by
So,
hand. It was
yeah,
Mary Pickersgill and her daughter hand sew it, so it's pretty
yeah.
cool.
Like it's crazy to think about the effort and how long it would take to go in and make a flag that huge. Um, but this flag is going to be a huge thing for American history and the future of America and everything that has to do with America. So old Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star Spangled Banner, was actually watching this battle from a cruise ship also out in the water. Um, so he was watching this battle. I believe he was actually on, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe he was actually on a like British warship doing prisoner negotiations. I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, he was Francis Scott Key was a lawyer. He was negotiating for a doctor that was a prisoner of war, but that doctor had been taking care of British troops on the ship as well. And so he had like when Francis Scott Key left to go out to this ship, he had multiple letters and stuff that he presented the British with and said, "Look, these are letters from your officers on the mainland that say, yes, Doctor, oh, it starts with a B. I'll never think of it, but anyway, that this doctor had been like nursing some soldiers and taking care of them, and that's kind of what got that doctor freed. But they freed him before the battle started, but the British said, "You're not going to leave this ship until the battle is over. We're keeping you here." So that's kind of how he gets into funny situation being on a prisoner ship.
Yeah. And so you're going to see he's watching this battle and he actually expected that Fort McHenry would fall to the British. Um so as he's sitting on that and like I said 25 hours straight of bombing. So they're going into the nighttime and everything and um as you know the rockets red glare bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. He was watching, and no matter when he would watch, if it was at nighttime or during the day or anything, that that flag was still there, still standing, showing that American spirit will not die. That it was just going to happen. Um, and the Americans were always going to stand tall. So he just currently he always during while he was watching the battle saw that flag standing, and that I'm sure seeing that, no, thinking that they were gonna fall, and the fort taking more like British shells, obviously, than the British were taking American shells. Seeing all that and expecting the fort to fall, but seeing that the American flag is still there, I can't imagine how powerful um, that was to see. And so he wrote a poem about it, which obviously became the Star Spangled Banner. So an interesting note to add to that is the Star Spangled Banner, his poem, got merged with a British drinking song called To an Acreon in Heaven. And so that, if you want to go give a listen to that, I listened to it earlier, and it's basically, I mean, you can definitely see where the inspiration came from in that. So those two mixed together to become our national anthem. However, um, the Star Spangled Banner didn't actually become our national anthem until I think around 1931. So you had this poem song there, um, which was huge at this time and everything, but it officially became the United States national anthem in 1931.
Yeah, so Francis Scott Key, the whole like opening line of said poem, Star Spangled Banner. Um, okay, Francis Scott Key is on said ship looking out. Okay, He turns to the doctor and he says, "Oh, say, can you see the flag?" And so that's kind of the whole conversation is like, he's like, you know, do you see the flag there? And it's like, oh, by the dawn's early light, there it is. And he says, like what so proudly we have held at the twilight's last gleaming. This flag that gets put up is the 30 by 42 flag that was hand sewn by Mary Pickersgill. Um, General Armistead had purchased it from Mary at the beginning of the war to have a second flag. The storm flag was taken down that next morning because with the driving rain, it had smeared a little bit, and the red and white stripes were a little, you know, odd looking. It almost looked British esque the way it was crossed, and so he's going to order in the morning that the flag that he bought before the war be put up, which was always put up for reveille every morning. So he puts up this giant flag, and as soon as it hits the air, it just unfurls, and it's just, I mean, 30 by 42 feet of American patriotism, and everybody is like,
Very broad stripes, might I say.
broad stripes and bright stars. It's all there. It's just massive. Those things were spangled on there. Them stars. It was actually a military term, the term spangling. But yeah, he's going to put that flag up, and it's going to unfurl and flying, and the people of Baltimore can see it, and the British see it. And it's like, holy cow! Not only is our fort still in American hands, it's got a bigger flag. Like these boys aren't going home; they're going to stand their ground. And that's like the British see that, and it's like, great. Now their flag is bigger. They're getting even more into this. And so it was just like a huge thing just to see that flag flying over in all of its star spangled glory. Yeah,
And an interesting little thing to add is because obviously his poem it got shortened for the song. There's some things in the poem that got left out, but an interesting thing he wrote in it was sorry, I'm looking at it right now. I, I lost my spot in it. Oh yeah, from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave. So he's showing you that in account for all these casualties going on, and everything, um, that flag was always there.
yeah, the flag was always there, and talking about the aftermath of that battle and looking into like it inspired the creation of the Star Spangled Banner poem. It's also a good thing to look into, like, while that was kind of like one of the things that came out of the battle and was a big, like, thing that is still around today. The aftermath of the battle itself was kind of important too. The British fleet are going to bombard Fort McHenry, but fail to take the position. And this British defeat was like the turning point of the War of 1812, really. So the U.S. had started the war by attacking Canada. They don't do too hot there. They fall back to Michigan and Ohio, and the British decide that they're going to go down the coast and attack on that southern end, which is going to get them to Washington D.C. And so they've got all this in plan, and they fail here. The next step for the British is going to be when they find out that, like, yeah, we can't get past Fort McHenry, and on top of that, they've got thousands of soldiers in between there and Baltimore. Um, they're going to turn towards a new theater of war. They're going to set sail to Pensacola and try to fight down on the southern end and take the U.S. like major shipping ports. At this time, the city of Pensacola is a pretty good city when it comes to shipping, importing, exporting. But the big one in the Gulf is going to be New Orleans. They're going to sail down to New Orleans and probably try to um, get through there, but it's just not going to go well. The British, by the time that the by the time the soldiers get to New Orleans, we'll have already ratified the Treaty of Ghent, but because of the U.S. political system, it has to pass through the House of Representatives and the Senate and be ratified by them before it can be enacted. So the war was kind of over, kind of not. By the time the British get around there, Napoleon is completely out of the picture in Elba still. He is not coming back from this exile. The delegates have already met and signed that treaty, but I guess the Tennessee in me is like the Battle of New Orleans is still cool, even though the war was over, because Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson, but they've their whole like own war going on at the same time. You know, they're fighting Native Americans who had allied with the British, and just Native Americans who didn't want America to take their land anyway. But yeah, it had a big outcome that was significant. I mean, like you said, there's the poem, there's forcing the British to retreat, kind of ending the war. And after this war, the British will not try to attack the U.S. again. So that is always good for us.
Yep. Like we've been saying, this is pretty much the beginning of America having a dominant military, um, being that military power or in the world, in all the wars that they've been in, pretty much. Um, you can see where this basically showed that the U.S. could stand their ground once again against a major global power that was Britain at the time. Um, so then after that, the global power kind of shifts from Britain to America, and all eyes are kind of on the American military throughout the rest of history up to today. A lot of things depend on what America does. I know we're gonna say stuff like that because we're proud Americans, so our military's great. Some other people probably think that they're, um, but that's the whole point of nationalism. We got to pride ourselves on our country and on that America's backbone that has been built by our military and by our civilians. And then one last thing I wanted to say is that because we were kind of showing this how the civilians built up our backbone. If you look at the battle in the War of 1812, you're going to see that there were tons of militia. And for those who don't know, militia are average citizens who group up to fight in a war. You're going to see a lot of that in a lot of it in the Revolutionary War. Then you're going to see a lot of it again in the War of 1812. And you're going to see that there were accounts of citizens who were willing to burn their homes before they would surrender. Um, and you're also going to see that each city kind of brought up new rules to keep everyone sharp and ready for if the British come to town, Baltimore being a big one.
Yeah. Do you know if you had any family members that ever fought in the War of 1812?
I don't think I did, but I also don't know for sure, but I don't think I did.
I think I had one. Well, no, I had two actually. One fought with Andrew Jackson, but another one I think was a fifer in the U.S. Army. So played flute. Pretty
Nice.
cool tie to me. But yeah, like you said, just a lot of cool things about this battle. And I mean, I know we typically try to do things that maybe not heard of or not really focused on. But I was thinking when we talk about the 4th of July and our whole thing is America's backbone, we're finding like the pivotal moments to get more recognition to them. This was just one of those things that was like, there's a lot here that we don't talk about that much because the War of 1812 is kind of swept under the rug. But the civilians being that backbone that put up those entrenchments and really gave everything to try to help the U.S. in its time of need. Um, it's just a perfect American backbone moment, especially for our 4th of July special.
Yep. And I think that pretty much wraps up this episode. Thanks, Avery, for joining me once again. Um, thanks everyone for listening. I'm sure you learned something. I know I did. So join us back. It should be in not next week, but the next week. We're trying to post bi-weekly, so we should be able to get something up. We are going to try to start having more of a social media presence and getting onto other platforms in the near future. So just stay updated for that. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. There's not much posted, but there soon will be. And if you want to follow us there, I'm pretty sure it's just America's or Battle Hardened AB or Battle Hardened America's Backbone, and you can find us on any of those platforms. Currently, we're going to try to expand. Updates will come on those platforms as well. So once
And
again,
if you, oh, sorry,
go ahead.
for those of us or those everybody that's watching, if you want to hear us talk about something that you think is kind of a backbone topic, drop it in the YouTube comments, any kind of social media post, DM, whatever. We are here for the people to talk about the backbone. So be interactive, keep on the lookout. Let us know what you want to see more of.
Yep, exactly. So once again, everybody, thank you for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks. And if you haven't, I highly recommend going and watching our last three episodes. This is episode four. So you can learn about the 25th Infantry, Doolittle Raid, Polar Bear Expedition, and now the Battle of Fort McHenry. So happy 4th of July for everyone that's watching this like today or tomorrow, or if you're watching it any other time, have a good day. So that's everything. We'll see you on the next episode.